Good evening, everyone. And I begin once again by thanking Overman Foundation for giving me the opportunity for these talks. We were discussing the different phases and ages of English poetry and following Sri Aurobindo. And before we go exactly into the details of the romantic poets followed by the Victorians, Sri Aurobindo has an intervening chapter where he is discussing in general the characteristics of what he calls the movement of modern literature, because he feels that modern literature in some ways begins with the romantic period. So we shall continue to explore the avenues English poetry took and the different turns it followed at various ages in this movement. We have been discussing the character and nature of English poetry, and we have seen what these have been in distinct phases and reached the point where we see the outburst of the fresh, new romantic spirit in its creations. That is, here we are talking about the pre romantics, that is, the kind of romantic revival which had taken place. And according to Sri Aurobindo, this is where English poetry has its modern beginnings. That is, we are roughly talking of the later 18th century and early 19th century England. So, before we take up the great romantics and their works directly, let us acquaint ourselves a little more with the background and characteristics of the age in England and also generally in Europe. So, first thing is we have to remember that here we are talking of a kind of renaissance, which is basically an awakening. So, here it was an awakening to the wonder and beauty of life. The mind of man began probing into nature in its curiosity and reflecting and commenting according to individual experience. It was an awakening and a discovery. However, it was the beginning only of the modern age, and in 19th century poetry of the Romantics, some initial tendencies of modernism are reflected. These beginnings, the characteristics of which we shall deal with presently, changed and progressed in form and meaning in the course of several decades, and by the first years of the 20th century, reached a subtle intensity and refinement, experimenting with a variety of motives and perhaps attempting to discover some occult truth in everything. So, this modern movement from the beginning is characterized by an ever widening curiosity, both intellectual and emotional, and an insatiable passion for knowledge. And here I'm quoting these phrases from Sri Aurobindo. So, the poets of the age were opened and awakened to all possibilities and seeking ever newer truths in life and things. But what is striking here is that there has been a larger awakening of the intellect also, leading to wider and deeper curiosity when the poets have felt the need to penetrate deeper and get at the truth of the universe. They set themselves upon a more extensive adventure. The modern spirit relies more on the power of the intellect and its search is after truth and gaining of knowledge. So let us take a look at the larger background of continental literature as in Sri Aurobindo's times. And Sri Aurobindo says that Europe followed the curve of the modern impulse more strongly, with more completeness than did English poetry. In Teutonic countries, there was the background of transcendental philosophy against which was set the German Romantic literature. And this was where they began this movement and which ended in the Scandinavian and Belgian writers who display both realism and psychological mysticism in their works. The Latin countries have their beginning in the works of, say, Rousseau, Chenier, Hugo, Chateaubriand. This artistic movement is carried forward by the Parnassians and shows its mark of decadence in Verlaine, Mallarmé, and others. So, this is more or less a continental scenario, and we get a clear view of the curve of poetry these poets followed, compared to which the English picture is not so distinct. And Sri Aurobindo says, in spite of the great achievements of individual poets, the total effectivity is of an inferior kind, and here the picture is a bit confused. But it fares better than the continent poets on one point, and that is, it goes beyond the intellect and the sensuous only, at least in the beginning, and ends also in this higher note. And where the general note is hazy in English poetry, the principal elements are distinguishable and stand out and are strongly pronounced in individual poets. The characteristic power and nature of the English poetic mind is reflected in and through the works of individual poets. They become distinct because of this. That is what Sri Aurobindo terms the self concentrated isolation. The individual energy had many new forces and material to work with. Among the forces that emerged in this age was an awakening to another vision of nature. There came about a more intimate visualization and a closer spiritual communion. In some of our future discussions, we shall study with examples from the works of these poets where these characteristic new forces are displayed. And all aspects of nature were subject to imaginative screening by the poets. They caught and scrutinized all the sights, sounds, and objects of nature around them. As the scientist observes and analyzes nature with the power of his intellect, so does the poet with his imaginative vision. And in the past, also, poets had done this, but it was more of a casual dealing with life and nature, where nature herself served more as a background for the poetic theme, or descriptions and images employed served only to enrich the mood of the poem and the audience. It was not like in modern times any subjective treatment of nature or any intimate personal response. There was hardly any intimate communion with universal life and nature. And where there was, rarely, it was through outer symbols of myths that it was projected. So, in modern times, things have changed. The ideas, perspectives, viewpoints, all are subject to the imaginative vision, which itself has extended widely. The way poets look at nature now is more as an independent entity and an equal or even a greater power which gives the impulse to poetic creation. So it's not just as a passive decorative background like in the past. So these poets have changed their methods and molds and in turn gifted us a world of new vision. Mysteries of nature are probed, its hidden aspects revealed in their works by vivid suggestions or by sensuously mystical treatment of the subject matter. So, what we get here is not so much a presentation as a reconstruction, an imaginative recreation of physical nature. The poet probes deep and reaches the inner truths of manifested nature and poetizes his own experience of it. It is an inner subjective experience that we get. So I just can't help quoting here one supreme example from a most memorable and popular poem by the great romantic English romantic William Wordsworth, who in his poem Tinton Abbey, he makes his own experience of nature the basic theme. And I'm quoting just a few lines where he's saying, the sounding cataract haunted me like a passion. The tall rock, the mountain, and the deep and gloomy wood, their colors and their forms were then to me an appetite, a feeling and a love that had no need of a remoter charm, but by thought supplied, nor any interest unborrowed from the eye. So, this is what Wordsworth has to say about nature, and this is one of the ways of responding to the universal spirit. So, this direct approach to nature was another and one distinct characteristic feature of this modern age. And Sri Aurobindo says there are two ways of this approach to nature which creates the nexus of experience between the poet and nature. One is, as we have just seen in Wordsworth's lines, how nature becomes a presence and is herself a great being. It goes beyond mere personification of nature. Here, nature is shown as having a life of her own and many emotions and moods too. The poets find even the objective manifestations, the conscious living presence of the spirit. And another way of approach is a sensitive response to nature, awakened and aroused in the poet by a strong emotion or sensation, or when thrilled and stirred by sheer beauty. And this response may be of satisfaction or dissatisfaction, of yearning and seeking. For instance, look at these lines from Shelley's very popular poem, Ode to the West Wind, which exemplify this, where the poet identifies the west wind, that is nature, as a mighty presence dominating life. And he writes, Wild spirit which art moving everywhere, destroyer and preserver, hear, oh hear. And then he makes this prayer to the uncontrollable west wind, and he writes, Oh, lift me as a wave, a leaf, a cloud. I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed. Be thou spirit fierce, my spirit, be thou me, impetuous one. So, in poems like this, we find an attempt to harmonize the individual mind and soul with the universal mind and soul, the objective manifestation of which is the visible nature. Now, this may be done through the power of the imagination or even the intellect. There is a seeking for a spiritual presence in nature and an attempt to harmonize the individual soul with it. For instance, in these lines, where the poet expresses involvement with nature and writes, and I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean, and the living air, and the blue sky, and in the mind of man. A motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. So this is Wordsworth again in the same poem, Tintern Abbey. So another new force that emerged during this movement was, according to Sri Aurobindo, a greater awakening of man to himself. This is also a kind of a parallel movement of science and poetry. One follows the track of the imagination and the other the intellect. Earlier, there were many limitations because speculations were of the superficial life mainly, and philosophy was also metaphysical. And when they took the past into account, it was in the mythological sense. Their view of the present was also not very profound, and Sri Aurobindo says in his characteristic way that their view of future was remarkable by its absence. So many of these barriers were broken down by the self expansion and widening of experience in the modern age. So, this age comes with its vast knowledge and subtle subjectivity. The poets live consciously and vividly in the past, present, and the future, and their view of time is universal, as is their view of man and nature. So, as we shall see later on, how all these trends are adequately reflected in the works of the modern poets, beginning with the English Romantics. So, another interesting point of its deviation from the past lay in the direction of the increasing interest in man himself. The older generations had ignored many things as uncouth and barbarous, but the moderns, with their eager and poetic probe into these things and romantic valuing, sought out the unfamiliar, the primitive, the orient, even ruins of the past, studied and took interest in the peasant and the outlaw and the rebel, in individual and solitary man. Here was a poet drawn towards nature, putting aside conventions and artificialities, and welcoming and embracing the strange and the mysterious and the attractive, and took for his theme and subject the wild and grand, as also the savage and lonely scenes. Thus, we have two major aspects of the modern movement. Philosophic naturalism is one, and a many hued romanticism the other. Now, naturalism is a literary movement of the late 19th century, a kind of extended realism, emphasizing determinism and scientific objectivity. As a 19th century movement, it was much influenced by Darwinism, and so the influence of heredity and environment were laid stress on in human life, and morality and judgment were relegated somewhat to the background. And Romanticism is noted by its interest in the fantastic, the occult, the supernatural. And its practitioners focus on the grotesque and the abnormal to achieve a unique artistic effect. So, evidently, these two motives clash on some points. And some salient features of the poetry of this age are, according to Sri Aurobindo, superficial medievalism, romanticized Hellenism, ideal transcendentalism. These are some characteristics of the age which begins in writers like Rousseau and Chateaubriand, includes Goethe, Schiller, Heine, Wordsworth, Byron, Keats, Shelley, and stretches to embrace the works of Hugo and others. This was, Sri Aurobindo says, the hasty transition from the Renaissance to the modern age, leaving us with crude, brilliant, complex, unfinished literature. Perhaps because the change was hasty, there was still much that the poets could not grasp and bring under the control of their poetic power. So there was much that was superficial and artificial, as in some of Byron's works, for instance. In the French romances, too, we find traces of the bizarre and overstrained elements. Looseness of form and intellectual shallowness also are some defects of the poetry of this age. Because of these, it has been said that falsity is the stumbling block of romanticism. Yet, whatever the faults and drawbacks, we do have many boons conferred by the Romantic age, which thrives upon the creation of new things, works with newer motives, and more importantly, widens immensely the field of the imagination. And some great work has been done by them and their successors, that is, the later 19th century poets, conveniently called the Victorian poets, who carried on with this impulse but in a different spirit and lessened inspiration. So, what we have here, that is the Victorian age. We have here is a portraiture of man and nature, but in an unimpassioned and impartial spirit, and everything done keeping in mind the motive art for art's sake. So there builds up an atmosphere of skeptical thinking. And there is also seen an attempt to read into the psychology of man and discover and reveal in poetry the inner truth and outer symbols of the religion and philosophy of humanity. But this phase was brief, and the next one that emerged out of it seemed to go against its very principles. And this paradox, taking on the colors of a revolt almost, is a feature of all human evolution, Sri Aurobindo tells us. And in this period of English poetry, the prominent note is that of realism, the posthumous child of romanticism, perverted by a pseudo scientific preoccupation. And these are Sri Aurobindo's direct words. So, art becomes a little more than scientific observation of life without the veil of imagination, without pretenses. It is a synthesized analysis. So, realism as such must deal with the present, as that can be brought under the scrutinizing lens and moves away from the past. And Sri Aurobindo says it treats life as if it were a psychological and physiological disease. We have talked of realism in art before in our previous talks. So, in its opposition to idealism, realism falsifies the ideal by synonymizing the idealism in man with the commonplace of his daily life and focusing on the ideal as only a pretension and a figment. Idealism aims at what lies beyond the apparent, and realism just about ignores this, rendering almost scientific facts in the name of art. So, realism, nevertheless, has brought in its own newer powers and motives, especially in fiction and drama. But to be dominated by realism and create under its strain would be the end of poetry, for the very spirit of poetry is the seeking after and aspiring for that which lies beyond and behind outward reality. So, in this phase, this objective realism has given rise to another movement in poetry where other creative powers have come into play, producing works of pronounced subjectivity. Now, Sri Aurobindo here points out an interesting feature of 19th century literary England, which displays all through a central contradiction between its aim and the character of its inspiration. The aim evidently is a profound objectivity, which is a general feature of the works of the age, of course, with exceptions. That is perhaps because this is in compliance with and suited to the temper of the age, which in itself was critical and with a scientific curiosity delved on the facts of life as they appeared to the eye. In fact, there was rapid and varied progress in science in all its branches in the 19th century. New theories were formulated, experiments conducted, treatises were written. So that's a clue to the temper of the age. The scientific inquiry requires a sort of elimination of one's personality, the discarding of the strong subjective element. In fact, the theory of objectivity was there in art also. For instance, Goethe had built up a similar philosophy of the aim of objectivity in artistic creation. Though his own works reflect his personality and the changes and growth of his personality too. But of course, that's another matter. Modern poets, however, followed this theory, and so their work is mostly a realistic presentation of life rather than a subjective interpretation. But this is one side of the story only. For another characteristic of the modern mind, strangely, is its growing subjectivity. The poets became conscious of the I, the individual soul, the self, and they explored this self in relation to the whole of life and nature. Now, this is not exactly the mystic's contemplation of the self, but it's a modern subjectivism where the response to nature is more subtle and stronger. And this was a consequence of the growing force of intellectualism. So, here it may sound a little strange, but when intensity of thought and emotion cannot be segregated, as in the mind of the scientist, there comes about a quickening of other parts of the mentality. So, in science, the objective turn is dominant. In art and poetry, the subjective turn, as the personality of the poet asserts itself. Even in poets like Goethe or Le Cortésia, or say Ibsen, Tolstoy, and others who profess objectiveness and realism in art, the subjective note makes its present felt and strongly felt. Uh, we have seen how Shakespeare also hides himself behind all his creations. His works give the illusion of holding up the mirror to nature as his mind, his poetic faculty, is only a faithful reflecting instrument. Later on, Browning too adopted the Shakespearean method of self concealment and represented well the spirit of his age, but of course could not become another Shakespeare. And this is because the characteristic self conscious thinking gets into his way, and even in his dramatic creations, we feel the presence of Browning, the creator, everywhere. And so Sri Aurobindo says Browning's characters become as much his masks as his creations. So, this is a modern feature where the poet remains as a presence and part of his work. Whereas in the past, what usually happened was a conscious process of self effacement in artistic creation. Now, both these have their merits and their drawbacks. When the personal, purely subjective factor was suppressed to the advantage of a general and impersonal motive in art, there has resulted great universal works in, say, architecture, painting, sculpture, and this could be achieved as many artistic minds were working in one spirit, Sri Aurobindo observes. And we need only delve lightly into the past to get ample proof. So consider any historic era, and we'll find the same type of structure and mold and theme in art, painting, sculpture. Say in India, in the Gandhar school, for instance, a particular style was employed in sculpture, and interestingly, even the materials used were of the same type. Similarly, Indian architecture has its own styles, typical of each particular era, like we have the Gupta style, Chola style, or consider the ancient rock paintings or Jain paintings. Each form a unique school of art. So, same can be said about literary art too. For instance, the epics, the romantic cycles of poetry. A particular age favored each type. And Sri Aurobindo also mentions the lyric cycles like the Vedic mandalas or the Vaishnav poetry. There may be infinite variations in the superstructure, but the fundamental material is the same. The modern artists differ not so much from their predecessors in methods and motives as in their handling of them, their subjective treatment of them. So, this lack of spiritual unity, which was a feature of the past, may be a drawback of modern art, but then it's recompensed with enhanced force and the enrichment of the inner personality. So we have more of psychological exploration into the life of man, which is lacking in works of the past. So Sri Aurobindo says the past comparatively is psychologically poor. In modern times, this psychological probing has been carried to its furthest limits through the trend of realism in art. And in turn, this realism has afforded us the means to escape from realism. Now, Sri Aurobindo explains this paradox in this way. He says a purely objective observation, representation of outward things is the way of realism, as we all know. But when it seeks to psychologize deeply, then the only way is to go back into the individual self, to go within. Because it is only by knowing our own psychology and only by our interaction and response with the psychology of others, only with identification with the mind and soul in others, that we can get a knowledge of the inner psychology of others. And Sri Aurobindo says that our psychological account of others is only an account of the psychological impressions of them they produce in our own minds. So, even when realistic writers delineate the psychology of their characters, it cannot be purely objective. A strong personal note informs the realistic renderings. The creative mind of the artist cannot consciously ignore the inner self, and so the work of art is strained by that conscious, intimate subjectivism. And Sri Aurobindo gives here examples of writers like Verlaine, Maeterlinck, and others. In Verlaine's poetry, we find this note, this expressions of intimate experience, and as Sri Aurobindo says, emotions in him are pushed beyond ordinary limits. So let's have a taste of Verlaine, and I can quote just a few lines here from one of his poems where he is writing: beside a humble stone, a tree floats in the cemetery's air, not planted in memoriam there, but growing wild, uncultured, free. A bird comes perching there to sing winter and summer, proffering its faithful song, sad, bittersweet. That tree, that bird are you and I. So, sensuality, nostalgia, personal, interpretative vision are characteristic of this French poet's style and language. Similarly, Maeterlinck's plays also project the passions of the desire soul in its many shades. And then that great poet Mallarmé, whose symbols are more subjective and personal, revealing to us the soul of the things that we see. In a note on Mallarmé elsewhere, Sri Aurobindo had written that Mallarmé arrived at a mystic speech, even if by wrestling with the French language, which was too limited for him. Because Mallarmé was concerned less with the outer emotions of life than with deeper spiritual or inner feeling. And in a letter Sri Aurobindo had written, symbolism, impressionism go beyond intellect to the pure sight, and Mallarmé was the creator of symbolism. So I'm quoting from his very famous poem translated as The Swan, for which Sri Aurobindo reserved much of his admiration. And of course, many translations are available. I'm quoting from one. And here's Mallarmé for us. He's writing, in past magnificence of thoughts today, the swan recaptures its freedom, but cannot make a song from surroundings, but only take on the sterile, dull glint of the winter's day. So the images and symbols sometimes are confusing as no straight, direct meaning can be extracted. It's beyond intellect. Thus, the age of reason ends in the rediscovery of the soul. At first, we arrive at a sort of what Sri Aurobindo terms psychological mysticism or psychism through the utterings of the desire soul. The next stage is of the emergence of higher and larger intuitive entity, and this is reflected in the Irish poets, according to Sri Aurobindo. The next stage of progress spells the end of pure intellectualism and passing on to the intuitive motive by a self exceeding of the very same intellectualism. And a new age of creation is born. There comes about a profounder interest in man's deeper self. But Sri Aurobindo says the most distinguishing characteristic of the modern mind is its interest in future man, once the task of religious preachers or isolated thinkers. In modern times, speculation on the future possibility is part of the general human outlook. This futurism also came in gradual stages, beginning with the partly naturalistic, partly transcendental idealism, which made man dream of the ideal conditions of life. With this was associated the idea of a spiritual liberty. This was followed by the more sober isms, all kinds of isms, that is, positivism, liberalism, utilitarianism. Then we had the democratic and social utopias, as Sri Aurobindo says, scientific and practical ideologies because of the advent of realism and rationalism. The newer force will be that of subjectivism, and poetry, Sri Aurobindo tells us, will be the natural interpreter of the inner and intuitive vision. And already we are steering away from the past and beginning unprecedented adventures. But all of the past cannot be left behind, of course. The past will count, but only as an inspiration for the future, if it can be that. The present, as Sri Aurobindo experienced and observed, was persistently and creatively forward. Nature and man and the visible universe is not the whole field of exploration. Man has been in search of deeper truths, of things beyond and after life, things which exceed him. But 19th century England, which is actually a topic of discussion here, has poorly reflected this in its art and poetry, as it has been mainly an age of doubt and skepticism and intellectual beliefs, some carried over from the past. This is characteristic mainly of the latter part of the 19th century. And even the ideal of philosophic transcendentalism was a very weak compensation, as the poetry of the age shows, with its notes of denial or defiant atheism. As Sri Aurobindo says, the English poetic mind passed into a new sense of the universal and the infinite, evolving out of itself a vivid pantheism. And the modern age is returning to subjective intuition, attempting to relate and project through its poetic symbols visions of the beyond and experience of the divine in nature and the universe. It is a journey from faith to heights of luminous knowledge, but through the intervening passages of doubt and denial. So here was a new mode of poetry going beyond all that had been achieved in the past. And Sri Aurobindo has predicted that hence poetry must follow either of two directions. It may end in a lingering decadence, or else must reach the opposite extreme in a luminous and satisfied self exceeding. But for now, as he saw it in his own times, it seemed to be ending in something that has to go beyond it. So, Sri Aurobindo actually predicts the coming of a futurist age when reason and intelligence shall be replaced by intuition. The present search for truth in the intellectual way is being substituted by the turn towards the truth of the spirit through the intensities of sight and feeling rather than the mere intellect. So, this is the main movement of the modern mind, a remarkable psychological evolution which has dominated most of European art and culture. So, it remains to be seen how it has affected the poetry of the English nation, and then we may predict the future possibilities of this poetry. Remnants of the intellectual age are there, but English poets may be the precursors of the future, inspired by their Celtic spirituality and also by the accents of some self assured messages, which Sri Aurobindo says have broken across the mental barriers between East and West, and this has come from resurgent India. So, in our next few discussions, we shall see what 19th century English poetry has to offer us, and beginning with the great English Romantic poets. So, thank you so much.